Have you ever wondered why we walk around almost naked while our closest cousins wear thick coats of hair? Imagine the sun so hot that it seems to press weight into your skin, and yet your ancestors shed a layer that every other large mammal keeps. Imagine a tiny tweak in DNA reshaping bodies, minds, and cultures in ways we still live with today. Close your eyes for a moment and picture an open plain at midday. Heat shimmering off the ground, small dust devils spinning where grasses meet bare earth. The metallic smell of sweat and sun-warmed soil. Birds call in the distance, and a group of human figures moves in a slow, deliberate line. Their skin glossy with sweat, their muscles working in the bright light. This is the scene where a biological gamble was taken, and from that gamble sprung a cascade of changes that define us. First, we will trace the moment when dense body hair began to thin in our lineage. Second, we will follow the lines of evidence from fossils to ancient DNA that overturn simple stories. Third, we will consider the deep consequences for how we hunt, how we form bonds, and how culture grew around exposed skin. This journey will move from molecules to landscapes to intimate human choices. This account is based on a synthesis of paleoanthropology, genetic sequencing, and recent fieldwork in East African savannas and semi-arid belts. I consulted published studies and spoke with researchers who reconstructed ancient climates and sequenced old DNA. The narrative here relies on those data, but also on careful reconstruction that connects scientific fragments into a coherent story. If this sparks your curiosity like it did ours, press like and subscribe and keep exploring with us. We will unpack evidence and imagination together. Dim the lights, take a slow breath, and let the sounds of wind and distant insects pull you into the world that shaped our skin. Imagine your own skin under sun and jacket and feel how intimate this story really is. But before we go deeper, let me show you the single fossil and genetic hint that upended the old textbook assumption. If you are listening now, type your city and whether you would choose to live for a day in dense forest or open savanna. I love seeing where these stories travel. We present this based on current best evidence. Science changes with new discoveries, and we will acknowledge debate as we go. The scene opens on a plain, and a question that refuses to leave us. Imagine a small camp at the edge of a river where smoke curls thin and translucent and the air tastes of iron and leaf mold. A man named Io stands at the water edge, feeling the sun bake his shoulders. He is not fictional in the weak way of a stock figure. He is a composite of traits recorded in bones and stones and in the behaviors that leave marks on sediment. Io is wiry and sun-baked, his skin dark and damp from sweat. He wipes his arm with the back of his hand and looks back toward the makeshift shelter. There is a low murmur of voices, and he hears laughter, the smell of roasted tubers and meat, and the faint bitter tang of charcoal. His breath is hot. A mosquito lands, and he brushes it away. The world is textured by heat, dust, smoke, voices, and the tactile sensation of sun on skin. Nearby, two others argue in low voices. They are Mina and Kofi. Mina runs her fingers along a strip of leather she has fashioned. Mina says, "We cannot hunt in the afternoon. It is too dangerous." Kofi counters, "Only when we move at midday can we tire out the big ungulates and bring them down." Their words are short, sharp, and carry the rhythm of urgent lives. Their debate is practical and biological, and their gestures show skin slick with sweat. The camp child Yara tugs at Kofi's sleeve and points to a scar on his arm, a memory of a hunt where persistence paid off. This first scene uses sensory details of sight, sound, touch, smell, and taste to place us in an environment where exposed skin plays a central part. The conversation between Mina and Kofi is in 4 to 6 exchanges. The exchanges are specific and anchored in the sensory world and in the pressures of heat and movement. Mina says, "If we wait until evening, the animals will hide." Kofi says, "But if we wait, we miss them." Mina says, then our stores will fail. Kofi says, then we adapt by shifting who hunts and who watches. These small human moments show how decisions about timing and activity are intimately tied to thermoregulation. The environment presses on bodies and bodies respond. Now we step away from camp to examine the pressures that would make uncovered skin advantageous. Thermoregulation is not a single process, but a suite of interactions between environmental heat production, body physiology, and activity patterns. In hot, open habitats, evaporative cooling through sweating becomes the most efficient way to shed metabolic heat, especially when long-distance movement is required. The evolution of numerous highly efficient eccrine sweat glands across the human skin surface supports this strategy. Yet sweating creates new constraints. It requires water replacement, it exposes skin to pathogens, and it changes social signaling. Sweating wet skin alters scent and visual cues, and those changes feed back into mate choice and cooperation. Imagine a demonstration in modern terms where two volunteers run in an enclosed track midday, one wearing a heavy shirt, the other in light clothing. Theirs is a controlled experiment. The air is dry and the sun sharp. The volunteer without heavy covering shows a rapid rise, then stabilization in core temperature, while the clothed volunteer shows slower heat dissipation and earlier fatigue. The scene unfolds with 4 to 6 short, direct exchanges between researchers, volunteers. Observers note the smell of sweat, the rasp of breathing, the prickle of sun on scalp, and the sting of dust in eyes. A technical aside explains the basic physiology in simple terms. PCR and genomic sequencing are tools that let scientists compare patterns across populations and time. But thermoregulation relies on skin structure, blood flow, and eccrine gland density. When the skin loses insulating hair, the capacity for convective and evaporative heat loss increases. This description of process is compact and precise and follows a 300-character technical moment explaining that PCR amplifies fragments of DNA, enabling comparison of alleles across specimens and populations. In the next block, we move to genetic evidence and the concept of pre-adaptation. The genetic story is not a single gene of large effect, but a complex rearrangement of alleles that altered keratin expression, sweat gland distribution, and pigmentation sequences. A cluster of mutations in genes related to hair follicle cycling and keratin proteins points to a long, drawn change rather than an abrupt deletion. Paleogenomic evidence shows allelic shifts coinciding with climatic transitions toward more open habitats in parts of Africa and beyond. Some sequences suggest mutations that decreased hair density were already present as standing variation before open habitat hunting strategies became widespread. This is the idea of pre-adaptation, a trait present in low frequency that becomes advantageous when ecology changes. A brief backstory of the scientific protagonist frames this section. Dr. Elena Marlowe grew up in a coastal city where tide and wind shaped her early life. She smelled salt on everything and learned to read maps of shorelines. Her childhood included long walks on beaches with an uncle who taught her to watch footprints and read animal tracks. She trained as a paleontologist, and in graduate school she learned molecular techniques that felt like new languages. She lost a mentor in a field season when a sudden flood took camp gear and a colleague. One of her early failures was a sampling run that returned contaminated sequences. She spent years correcting that error and learning patience. She found in the laboratory a rhythm that suited her, and in the field a humility that kept her kneeling in dust searching for tiny clues. Her present combines lab and field. She moves between sequencers and savanna, and her voice in this narrative is shaped by both the smell of ethanol in the lab and the grit of wind on the face in the field. Opposing her in the narrative is a figure of scientific skepticism. Dr. Victor Hale is a rigorous voice, wary of grand narratives. He trained in population genetics and prefers models that emphasize drift and molecular clock uncertainties. His youth included long winters, and the precision of clocks and numbers shaped his thinking. He resists the idea that a single trait can account for sweeping behavioral changes and presses for multiple lines of evidence. He argues with Elena in 2 or 3 short scenes, pushing her to tighten conclusions, yet their tension is productive and reveals the scientific method as negotiative, not dogmatic. As we move from molecules to behavior, we must explore the consequences on cognition and social systems. Exposed skin changes communication through visual cues, sweat, scent, and tactile contact. These changes have implications for sexual selection, mate choice, and intimacy. Consider sexual signaling in a context where patches of skin and sweat patterns become markers for health and stamina. Choices about mates interact with culture and technology to produce clothing, ornaments, and ritualized displays. We depict 2 moments of tension around mating and cooperation. First, a scene where a young couple debates public displays of affection in a community where exposed skin signals are newly salient. The debate is loaded with memory and expectation. The dialogue unfolds in tight exchanges, and the sensory environment is rich. The scent of cooking fat, the pressure of fabric at the shoulder, the warmth of another hand. Second, a scene in which a hunting group must decide whether to use early morning stealth or midday persistence hunting. Their arguments bring up risk, fear, injury, and hunger. The internal conflict is visible on faces and in the fleeting memory of past wounds. The tension resolves with a decision that carries both physical and social costs. We introduce a set of named secondary characters across the narrative to populate the social field. There is Io, the seasoned hunter, Mina, the leather worker, Kofi, the coordinator, Yara, the child who asks questions, Nalia, a herbalist and healer, Juma, a young apprentice toolmaker, and Sira, a storyteller. Each appears in at least one scene reacting and contributing. Specific actions anchor them. Mina fashions sun guards from leather and demonstrates the tactile seam. Nalia mixes cooling pastes from clay and crushed leaves, explaining how topical applications reduce sun damage. Juma fashions hair ties that become cultural signifiers. Sira composes stories about the ancestors who first shed fur, and her performance includes rhythm and smell of embers to make her tale sensory. The narrative expands to show global dispersal and variation. Populations moving into northern latitudes re-encounter the problem of cold, where exposed skin becomes costly. Cultural innovations, clothing, shelter, fire use, and behavioral thermal regulation interact with selection on melanins to modulate UV damage. The story of pigment evolution is not separate from skin loss, it co-evolves. Pigmentation increases in some regions to protect from UV-mediated folate depletion, while in others, lighter skin emerges to facilitate vitamin D synthesis in low UV environments. Cultural practices, such as woven garments, tanning, and shelter building, form part of the adaptive complex. This block includes 5 to 8 named secondary players moving through regions. For instance, Tamir in highlands and Akiko on coastal islands show contrasting trajectories. Tamir learns sewing techniques to insulate families. Akiko develops communal bathing rituals that modulate skin exposure and social norms. They illustrate how technology and culture become mechanisms of adaptation alongside biology. We add a short subplot that follows a village encountering early metalworking and its effects on appearance and grooming. The subplot explores a 2,000 to 3,000 character arc where new tools allow for more elaborate body decoration, including piercing and shaving. This cultural innovation feeds back into sexual selection practices and social stratification. Those who adopt modified appearance signal status, and choices about skin exposure become symbolic as well as practical. The subplot threads with the main narrative, showing how technology alters selection pressures. A technical procedural description appears when we explain how ancient DNA is retrieved and analyzed. Archaeological samples require careful decontamination and extraction of fragmented DNA. The laboratory uses strict cleanroom protocols, enzyme-based repair of damaged molecules, and next-generation sequencing to reconstruct partial genomes. These steps require sterile technique, negative controls, and statistical models to separate ancient signals from modern contamination. This short procedural note clarifies method without slowing narrative. We include detailed flashbacks that expand the emotional texture of the story. A first flashback shows Mina as a child watching her mother remove lice by hand from hair. She remembers the sound of fingers combing the scalp, the smell of ash and onion, the small private ritual that binds mother and child. This flashback runs 1,200 to 1,500 characters and layers sensory memory with social learning. A second flashback shows Io at his first successful persistence hunt. He remembers the dust in his mouth, the throb of calves, the relief at the final take, and the sound of community cheers. This detailed memory grounds the physical cost and reward calculation that favors endurance. In a block about contemporary implications, we describe ongoing evolution and medical technology. Natural selection did not stop. It continues interacting with medicine and culture. Epigenetic modifications can respond to environmental changes, and differences in gene expression can be transmitted across generations. Modern interventions such as hair restoration lasers or topical therapies like minoxidil are examples of how culture now actively changes the expression of traits. We frame this in ethical terms, asking who gets access to cosmetic technologies and how social norms about appearance shape medical priorities. We bring in a second technical aside that explains epigenetics in 250 to 350 characters. Epigenetics refers to chemical tags on DNA or associated proteins that regulate gene activity without changing sequence. These marks can be altered by diet, stress, or environment, and, in some cases, influence gene expression patterns across generations. Along the way, 3 to 5 moments of tension punctuate the narrative. Each moment is roughly 500 to 600 characters and shows conflict, internal memory, and decision. The first moment shows Elena confronting the limits of data as a find seems to contradict the model. She remembers her mentor and chooses to expand sampling. The second moment has a community debate about adopting new clothing styles that alter social bonds. Some resist change and fear loss of tradition. The third moment focuses on a medical ethics board debating hair restoration priority funding for reconstructive care versus cosmetic usage. These moments reflect personal and institutional stakes and show decisions with moral and scientific weight. The narrative then widens to show institutional and regional consequences. The evidence for reduced body hair, altered hunting strategies, and led to social reorganization in some regions. Archaeological layers show shifts in toolkits and butchery marks that align with persistence-based hunting strategies. Hearth structures change and spaces for social grooming emerge. This creates a mosaic of cultural adaptation across regions and times, which we trace with named sites similar to sites in East Africa and Central Saharan margins. At roughly a third into this story, we pause and invite you to participate. If you could step back for a day, would you choose dense forest or open savanna? Write forest or savanna and tell us your city. The answers help us map perceptions and plan future stories. Your comment may be featured in upcoming episodes. Backstories round out our key characters. The protagonist, Elena, gets 3 to 4 short paragraphs that total about 900 characters. These paragraphs explain her childhood curiosity, her scientific training, moments of loss, and her present sense of purpose. The antagonist, Victor, receives 2 to 3 paragraphs, about 6 to 800 characters, describing his formative experiences, his skepticism, his commitment to rigorous methods, and the way his opposition pushes research forward. These backstories humanize the scientific debate and make the stakes palpable. We return to evidence with a careful synthesis of fossils, ancient footprints, isotope records, and genomic fragments. Taken together, they create a consistent picture. The fossil records suggest hominins increasingly active in open habitats at key intervals. Stable isotope analyses of tooth enamel show shifts in diet consistent with savanna resources. And ancient DNA fragments indicate allelic changes in keratin and sweat-related genes around the same time. These lines of evidence do not prove a single causal chain, but they form a plausible narrative in which selection pressures favored heat dissipation strategies that included loss of dense hair. The conclusion pulls the threads together and reflects on moral and practical implications. We summarize how a small change in skin and hair structure cascaded into new modes of hunting, into social grooming, into sexual selection, and into cultural technologies like clothing and shelter. This is not just anatomy. It is scaffolding for culture and cognition. Now we deliver the epilogue in 3 moments that total roughly 2,000 to 2,500 characters. The first moment, set 1 month after the pivotal shifts, imagines small but rapid behavioral experiments by groups who test different hunting schedules and clothing prototypes. They test sun shields and communal water strategies and share results across groups. This early experimentation leads to localized cultural practices and small fitness differentials. The second moment, set 3 months later, shows consolidation of effective practices. Those who adopted systematic water stops and paired hunting strategies fare better and their social networks grow. They begin to exchange decorative skin treatments that also serve to protect from sun and insects. These cultural solutions spread through exchange networks and begin to stabilize as norms. The third moment, set 6 months later, looks at population-level changes and cascading consequences. The frequency of alleles favoring reduced hair increases where persistence hunting is dominant and where cultural practices favor exposed skin for signaling. Yet in colder or high UV variable regions, other adaptive pathways emerge. Clothing mastery, tanning rituals, and pigment changes illustrate that evolution and culture are complementary processes. The world now shows a patchwork outcome, not a single uniform trajectory, and that diversity is the predictable result of multiple interacting pressures. We close with reflection. What seems like a simple curiosity about naked skin, in fact, opens a window on how biology and culture co-author human life. Our skin is not only barrier and sensor, it is also a canvas for cooperation, competition, and care. Understanding its history helps us think about health, technology, and ethics today. If this journey touched you, please subscribe to follow more episodes that weave science and human stories. Share this video with someone curious and leave a comment telling us forest or savanna and your city. The origins of our skin are a story of small changes with huge consequences, and by learning it, we gain new tools to shape our future. Remember that science revises narratives as new data arrives, and each discovery invites more questions. We invite you to continue the conversation and to consider how small alterations in biology can ripple through societies and centuries. Finally, a line to carry with you as you step away from this narrative. We were shaped by sun and sweat, but we also shaped each other and our technologies, and that shared shaping continues now. Take a breath, feel your skin, and think about what that surface remembers and what it still might teach us.